I stopped at a yard sale. One sofa changed both our lives forever. Grace Whitfield almost didn't stop that Saturday morning. She was driving home from the grocery store, tired after a long week, thinking mostly about the pile of laundry waiting for her and the bills stacked on her kitchen counter. But something about the small, hand-painted sign at the end of a quiet street caught her eye. Yard sale. Today only. Everything must go. And something in her, some small, tired part of her that still believed in small good moments, made her turn the car around. The yard sale was modest. A folding table with old kitchen items, a box of children's books, a rack of clothes that had clearly been loved for many years, and, near the back of the driveway, half covered by a dusty sheet, a large green sofa that looked, at first glance, like nothing special at all. Grace almost walked past it, but something about the fabric pattern, a soft, old-fashioned floral print, reminded her powerfully of her grandmother's living room, a memory so vivid and unexpected that she found herself standing in front of the sofa for a long moment, simply looking at it. "That one's been in the family a long time," said the man running the sale, a tired-looking older gentleman named Walter, noticing her interest. $20 if you want it. My wife and I are downsizing, moving into a smaller place next month." Grace, who had not been planning to buy furniture that day, found herself saying yes anyway. The sofa was heavier than it looked, and Grace, who lived alone and had no one readily available to help her move it, ended up asking two teenage boys from down the street to help load it into the back of her small pickup truck for a few extra dollars. Getting it into her apartment was its own small adventure. Several close calls on the narrow stairwell, one moment where she genuinely worried the sofa would get permanently stuck between the wall and the banister. But eventually, with much effort and a fair amount of laughing at her own predicament, she managed to get it settled into her small living room, replacing the sagging, second-hand couch she'd had since college. It looked, she thought, stepping back to admire it, exactly like something that belonged in her home. A little worn, a little old-fashioned, but warm and solid in a way that made the room feel instantly more like somewhere a person actually lived, rather than simply somewhere a person slept between long days of work. She sat down on it that evening with a cup of tea, running her hand along the soft, faded fabric, feeling an odd, comforting sense of rightness about the purchase, even though she couldn't have explained exactly why. It was only 2 days later, while running her hand along the underside of one of the cushions, that she felt something unusual, a slight lump beneath the fabric lining, tucked into a small gap in the stitching along the bottom seam. Curious, Grace carefully worked her fingers into the small gap, gently pulling until whatever was hidden there came loose. It was an envelope, old, slightly yellowed, sealed carefully, with a single word written across the front in neat, careful handwriting. "Sophia." Grace stared at the envelope for a long moment, uncertain what to do. It clearly wasn't meant for her. It was equally clear that whoever had hidden it inside that sofa cushion had done so deliberately, carefully, perhaps even desperately, tucking it somewhere they believed it would remain safe. She thought about simply opening it, curiosity getting the better of her, but something about the careful, deliberate way it had been hidden made her hesitate. This felt like something private, something that belonged to someone, somewhere, who might still be looking for it. She decided, instead, to try to return it. Grace remembered the address of the yard sale, and though she felt a little foolish doing so, she drove back the following Saturday, hoping Walter and his wife hadn't yet completed their move. She was in luck. Walter answered the door himself, looking mildly surprised to see her. "The sofa I bought from you last weekend," Grace explained, holding up the envelope. "I found this hidden inside one of the cushions. It's addressed to someone named Sophia. I thought maybe it belonged to your family." Walter's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, then something like recognition, and finally, unmistakably, a deep, quiet sadness. "That sofa belonged to my late wife's mother," he said slowly, taking the envelope carefully from Grace's outstretched hand. "Sophia was my wife's mother's name too, actually. My wife was named after her. This sofa's been in the family for almost 60 years. I had no idea anything was hidden inside it." "Do you know who might have written it?" Grace asked. Or when? Walter turned the envelope over carefully in his hands, studying the handwriting with an expression of growing emotion. I think, he said quietly, this might be from my wife's father. He passed away almost 40 years ago, before I ever met my wife. I don't know much about him. My wife rarely spoke of him. I think there was some kind of falling out, long before I came into the picture. Walter invited Grace inside, and over cups of coffee at his kitchen table, he shared what little he knew of the story, piecing together fragments his late wife, Marianne, had shared with him reluctantly over their many years of marriage. Marianne's mother, Sophia, had been married young, in the early 1960s, to a man named Joseph, Marianne's father. According to the little Marianne had ever revealed, Joseph had left the family when Marianne was very young, under circumstances Marianne herself never fully understood or discussed, even with her own husband. She never wanted to talk about him, Walter said. I asked over the years, a handful of times, but she always changed the subject. I got the sense there was real pain there, pain she'd decided, long before I ever met her, to simply not revisit. Did she ever mention where he went, or whether they stayed in contact at all? Grace asked. Never, Walter said. As far as I understood, he simply left one day, and that was the end of any relationship her mother had with him. Sophia raised Marianne alone after that, and by all accounts never remarried, never really spoke of him again either, at least not that Marianne ever shared with me. He looked down at the sealed envelope again, turning it slowly in his hands. I don't know if I should open this, he admitted. It feels like it belongs to a part of my wife's history I never had access to, even while she was alive. I'm not sure it's my place to finally open that door now, after she's gone. Grace, sensing the weight of the moment, chose her next words carefully. I think, she said gently, that's really your decision to make, Walter. But if it were me, I think I'd want to know. Whatever's inside that envelope clearly mattered enough to someone that they hid it carefully, hoping it would eventually be found. That feels to me like someone who wanted very badly to be understood, even if circumstances never allowed it while they were alive. Walter sat quietly for a long moment, studying the envelope, clearly wrestling with the decision. Would you stay while I open it? He asked finally. I know that's an odd request, given we only just met, but I don't have anyone else close by right now, and I think I'd like someone else present, whatever's inside. Grace, surprised by the request, but moved by the vulnerability behind it, agreed without hesitation. Walter carefully opened the old envelope, his hands trembling slightly, and unfolded several pages of neat, careful handwriting inside. The letter, dated nearly 40 years earlier, was written by Joseph, Marianne's father, addressed to his wife Sophia. My dearest Sophia, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, after everything I've done. I left when you and Marianne needed me most, during the hardest year of our lives, and I have spent every single day since regretting that choice more deeply than I know how to properly express. I want you to know the truth, even if it comes too late to matter. I did not leave because I stopped loving either of you. I left because I had gotten myself into serious financial trouble, debts I was too ashamed to admit to you, mistakes I made trying to provide better for our family than my own income allowed. I believed, foolishly, that disappearing would somehow protect you both from the consequences of my failures, rather than facing them honestly alongside you, the way a real husband and father should have. I have tried, many times over the years, to write to you properly, to explain myself, to ask for even a small chance to make things right. I have never found the courage to actually send those letters. I am writing this one now because I am unwell, and I fear, if I do not say these things somewhere, they will simply disappear with me when I go. I do not expect forgiveness. I only want you to know that not a single day has passed where I haven't thought of you and our daughter, and regretted, completely, the choice I made all those years ago. If there is ever a chance, however small, that this letter finds its way to you, please know that my love for you both was always real, even though my courage to face our difficulties honestly was not. With all my remaining love, Joseph, Walter read the letter twice, his eyes filling with tears by the second reading, before setting it down carefully on the kitchen table. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "If he wrote this, why didn't he ever send it? Why hide it inside a sofa cushion, of all places?" Grace, equally moved by what they'd just read, considered the question carefully. "Maybe he was afraid," she said gently. "Sometimes people hide things they're not brave enough to actually share directly, hoping in some quiet corner of themselves that fate will find a way to reveal the truth eventually, without them having to bear the full weight of delivering it themselves." "My wife never got to read this," Walter said, his voice breaking slightly. "She died 3 years ago, still believing her father simply abandoned her and her mother, without any real explanation. If I had known this sofa held something like this inside it, I would have torn it apart, searching, years ago, just for the chance to give her this." Grace reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "None of us could have. But maybe there's still something meaningful you can do with it now, even though it's too late for Marianne to read it herself." Walter, after a long, thoughtful pause, revealed something Grace hadn't expected. "Marianne's mother, Sophia, my wife's mother, she's actually still alive," he said slowly. "She's in her 90s now, living in a care facility about an hour from here. I haven't visited as often as I should, honestly, since Marianne passed. It's been difficult, being reminded of my wife every time I see her mother's face." Grace felt a sudden, powerful conviction settle over her. "Walter," she said carefully, "I think you need to bring her this letter." Walter looked up, clearly startled by the suggestion. "After 40 years?" he said. "She's nearly 95. I don't know if this would even help her. At this point, it might just open up old, painful wounds she's long since made peace with. Or," Grace said gently, "it might give her the one thing she's likely spent decades wondering about, the truth of why the man she loved left, and confirmation that his love for her and her daughter was real, even if his courage wasn't. I think, at 95, that kind of clarity might matter more than we realize, not less." Walter sat quietly for a long moment, turning the letter over carefully in his hands, clearly weighing the risk of reopening old pain against the possibility of finally offering real closure. "Would you come with me?" he asked finally. "I don't think I can do this alone." The following Tuesday, Grace accompanied Walter to the care facility where Sophia now lived, both of them nervous in their own ways about how the frail, elderly woman might react to finally learning the truth her husband had hidden away, quite literally, inside the very sofa she had once owned. Sophia was seated in a comfortable chair near a sunny window when they arrived, small and frail but alert, her eyes brightening with genuine warmth when she recognized Walter. "Walter," she said, her voice thin but clear. "It's been too long, dear. How are you managing, since Marianne?" "I'm managing," Walter said gently, taking a seat beside her, gesturing for Grace to sit as well. "Sophia, I need to tell you something. Something important, and a little difficult, so please, take your time with it." He explained, carefully and slowly, how Grace had found the sofa at his yard sale, how she had discovered the hidden letter, how they had, together, decided this was something Sophia deserved to see, whatever the emotional cost of finally reopening that old chapter of her life. Sophia listened with quiet, focused attention, her expression giving little away until Walter finally handed her the letter itself, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the old pages. Sophia read the letter slowly, her lips moving faintly as she worked through Joseph's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, occasionally pausing to press a trembling hand against her mouth. By the time she finished, tears were streaming freely down her weathered face, though her expression, Grace noticed carefully, held something more complicated than simple grief, something that looked, unmistakably, like relief. "I always wondered," Sophia said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "For 40 years I wondered whether he simply stopped loving us, whether we weren't enough to keep him, whether I had done something wrong that drove him away. I built an entire understanding of my own worth around that uncertainty, without ever having the real answer." "He clearly loved you both very much," Grace said gently. He just made a terrible mistake in how he handled the difficulty he was facing. Debts, Sophia said softly, almost to herself. I never knew about any serious debts. I knew we struggled sometimes, the way most young couples did back then, but I never imagined it was serious enough to drive him away completely. If only he had told me. If only he had trusted me enough to face it together, instead of running. I think, Walter said carefully, he understood that too, eventually. I think that's part of why he wrote this letter at all, even if he never found the courage to send it while he was alive. Sophia held the letter gently against her chest, closing her eyes for a long moment, clearly processing 4 decades of uncertainty finally, unexpectedly, resolving into something like understanding. Thank you, she said finally, opening her eyes to look at both of them. Thank you both, more than I know how to properly express. I never expected, at 95 years old, to finally receive an answer I'd stopped hoping for decades ago. The visit, while deeply moving, also brought a fresh wave of grief for Sophia. Grief not just for the husband she'd lost touch with so long ago, but for her daughter, Marianne, who had died without ever knowing the truth her mother now finally understood. My daughter carried so much anger toward her father her whole life, Sophia said quietly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue Grace had gently offered. I tried, over the years, to soften that anger, though I never had the real story to offer her either. I only wish she could have read this too, before she passed. I think it would have eased something in her that never fully healed. Maybe, Grace offered carefully. There's still a way to honor that, even now. Perhaps sharing this story, and the letter, with Marianne's own children, if she had any, might carry some of that healing forward, even if it comes a generation later than it should have. Sophia looked up, considering this thoughtfully. Marianne had one daughter, she said slowly. My granddaughter, Lisa. She lives several states away now. We don't speak often. I think some of Marianne's old pain about her father passed down to her too, in ways none of us ever properly addressed. Perhaps it's time that changed. Walter, with Sophia's blessing, reached out to Lisa in the following weeks, carefully explaining the discovery of the letter and the remarkable chain of events that had led to it finally being read, decades after it was written. Lisa, initially skeptical and guarded, understandably wary, given the complicated family history surrounding her mother's relationship with her own absent grandfather, eventually agreed to a phone call with Sophia, her grandmother, to discuss the discovery directly. The call, which Sophia later described to Grace and Walter during a follow-up visit, was emotional and difficult, but ultimately healing in ways none of them had fully anticipated. She cried through most of it, Sophia said, smiling faintly despite the tears that still came easily whenever she discussed the subject. She told me she'd spent her whole life believing her grandfather was simply a coward who abandoned his family without explanation, the same story her mother had passed down to her, without any real details to soften it. Learning the truth, that he loved them, that he was ashamed and afraid rather than simply indifferent, she said it changed something in how she understood her own mother's pain too, and by extension her own. Do you think she'll want to visit? Grace asked. She's already planning a trip, Sophia said, her face brightening with genuine hope. She wants to see the letter herself, and to finally properly meet me in person, after so many years of distance. I think, in a strange way, this whole difficult chapter of our family's history might finally be closing properly, after 4 decades of quiet, unresolved pain. As the weeks passed, and Grace continued to stay in touch with Walter and Sophia, following the unfolding story of Lisa's planned visit with genuine investment, she found herself reflecting on her own life in ways she hadn't expected when she'd first turned her car around for that yard sale sign. Grace, 34 years old, had spent the past several years focused almost entirely on rebuilding her own life after a difficult divorce that had left her, in many ways, feeling as uncertain about her own worth as Sophia had once felt about hers. Her ex-husband Daniel had left the marriage abruptly 3 years earlier, citing vague dissatisfaction that he never fully explained, leaving Grace with a similar, painful uncertainty about what exactly had gone wrong, what she might have done differently, whether the failure of the marriage reflected some deeper inadequacy in herself she had never properly identified. Watching Sophia finally receive the answers she'd waited decades for stirred something unexpected in Grace. A quiet, growing recognition that she, too, deserved real understanding about her own difficult chapter, rather than simply carrying vague, unresolved uncertainty indefinitely. She found herself, for the first time in 3 years, considering reaching out to Daniel directly, not to reconcile, but simply to ask, honestly, for the real explanation she had never received. After careful consideration and a long conversation with her closest friend about whether this was truly a healthy step or simply reopening old wounds unnecessarily, Grace decided to send Daniel a brief, careful email. Daniel, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out about something that's been on my mind. I've spent the past 3 years without a clear understanding of why our marriage ended so abruptly. I'm not writing this hoping to reconcile or to reopen old arguments. I'm simply asking, honestly, if you'd be willing to give me the real explanation, whatever it is. I think I deserve that much, and I think, honestly, so do you. The chance to finally say whatever you never felt able to say at the time. Grace? Daniel responded within a few days, his reply longer and more honest than Grace had expected. Grace, you're right that I owe you a real explanation, one I should have given you 3 years ago, instead of simply leaving the way I did. The truth is, I was struggling with serious anxiety and depression during that period of our marriage, struggling in ways I was deeply ashamed of, and too proud to properly address with you, or with any professional help. I convinced myself, foolishly, that leaving would somehow spare you from watching me fall apart, rather than facing it honestly together, the way a real partner should have. I've been in therapy since then, working through a lot of what I avoided facing at the time. I understand now how much damage my silence and my sudden departure caused you, on top of everything else. I'm deeply sorry for that. You deserved so much better than the uncertainty I left you with. Daniel. Grace read Daniel's response several times, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions, some lingering sadness for the pain they'd both clearly carried separately during those difficult years, but also, unmistakably, a growing sense of relief and clarity that had been missing for 3 long years. She thought of Sophia, finally understanding, at 95, that her husband's departure had come from fear and shame rather than a lack of love. She thought of her own situation, now similarly clarified, not excused exactly, since Daniel's silence had genuinely hurt her deeply, but at least, finally, explained. She wrote back to Daniel, thanking him honestly for his openness, wishing him well in his continued healing, without reopening any door toward reconciliation, since she recognized clearly that whatever love had once existed between them had already run its course, regardless of the reasons behind its ending. But the exchange left her feeling lighter, somehow, in a way she hadn't expected, as though understanding the true shape of her own painful chapter had finally allowed her to fully close that book, rather than leaving it permanently, uncomfortably ajar. I think, she told her friend later that week, finding that letter in the sofa taught me something important. Sometimes the not knowing is worse than even a difficult truth. I'm glad I finally asked for mine. A month later, Lisa arrived to visit her grandmother, and Grace, at Sophia's warm invitation, was present for the emotional reunion, having become, in the strange, unexpected way these things sometimes happen, a genuine and trusted part of this family's unfolding story. Lisa, in her late 30s, bore a striking resemblance to the old photograph of Sophia that sat on a small table beside her chair, the same careful, watchful eyes, the same gentle set of the mouth. The reunion between grandmother and granddaughter was tearful and warm, decades of quiet distance finally beginning to dissolve as they sat together, sharing old photographs, old memories, and, eventually, Lisa reading her great-grandfather Joseph's letter for herself. I always thought, Lisa admitted, wiping tears from her eyes as she finished reading, that my grandfather was simply a bad man. That's the story my mother always told, even if she never gave many details. Reading this, understanding that he was scared and ashamed and genuinely regretful, It doesn't erase what he did, but it makes it feel more human somehow. Less like a simple villain story, and more like a real, complicated person who made a terrible mistake he never knew how to fix. That's exactly how I felt too, Sophia said softly, reaching over to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. I'm only sorry it took 40 years, and your mother's passing, for us to finally understand that together. Inspired by everything that had unfolded since that unexpected yard sale purchase, Walter made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than continuing to downsize his possessions carelessly, as he'd originally planned, he decided to keep several pieces of family furniture that held real sentimental history, including, at Grace's gentle suggestion, the very sofa that had started this entire remarkable chain of events. I think, he told Grace, during one of their now regular visits, I'd like to actually keep this sofa in the family, if you're willing to part with it. I know that's an unusual request, given you're the one who found it and brought this whole story to light, but it feels like it belongs somewhere close to Sophia now, given everything it's helped uncover. Grace, who had grown genuinely fond of this unexpected extended family over the past several months, agreed without hesitation, feeling that the sofa's journey, from Sophia's original home to Walter and Marianne's household, to Grace's own apartment, and now, finally, back toward Sophia herself, carried a kind of poetic rightness that felt important to honor. The sofa was moved, with some effort, into a small sitting area at Sophia's care facility, where she could sit on it regularly, surrounded by the same fabric and shape that had once furnished her own home so many decades earlier, now carrying with it the added, hard-won weight of truth finally uncovered after 40 long years. As the months passed, and the remarkable story of the yard sale sofa continued to unfold and heal old family wounds, Grace found herself growing increasingly close to Walter as well, not romantically, at least not at first, but through the genuine, deep friendship that had formed between them through this shared, unexpected journey. Walter, still processing his own grief over Marianne's death, found in Grace a steady, compassionate presence who understood, in her own way, the complicated experience of uncertain endings and difficult questions left unanswered for too long. I don't think I ever properly thanked you, Walter told her one afternoon, sitting together in Sophia's small garden at the care facility, watching Sophia doze peacefully nearby on a warm spring day. For turning your car around that day, for bringing that letter back to us instead of simply keeping it, or throwing it away without a second thought. You gave my wife's family something none of us ever expected to receive, real, honest closure, even if it came too late for Marianne herself. I almost didn't stop, Grace admitted. I was tired, thinking about 100 other things. Something just made me turn around that day. I'm glad I listened to it. Over the following year, their friendship deepened gradually into something neither of them had expected, but both, eventually, came to welcome. A careful, gentle partnership built not on the sudden intensity of new romance, but on the steady, hard-won understanding that comes from sharing something genuinely meaningful together. 1 year after that unexpected yard sale purchase, Grace sat once more on the same green floral sofa, now permanently settled in Sophia's small sitting room at the care facility, surrounded by an unlikely but genuinely loving extended family that had formed entirely by chance, out of a simple decision to turn a car around on a tired Saturday morning. Sophia, now 96, and remarkably spry for her age, sat beside her, holding hands with Lisa, who had begun visiting monthly since their initial reunion, gradually rebuilding the relationship that decades of unresolved family pain had once made impossible. Walter sat nearby, his hand resting gently on Grace's shoulder, the two of them now several months into a quiet, comfortable relationship that had grown naturally out of their shared experience, without either of them needing to rush or force what had developed organically between them. It's strange, Grace said, looking around at the small, warm gathering, how one small decision, stopping at a yard sale I almost drove right past, ended up changing so many lives. Yours, Sophia's, Lisa's, mine. Even Daniel's, in a smaller way, since finding that letter is part of what gave me the courage to finally ask him for my own answers. I think, Sophia said softly, her eyes bright with the particular wisdom that comes only from a very long, very full life. That's simply how meaningful things often happen. Not through grand plans, but through small, quiet moments of choosing to pay attention, to turn around, to open the door instead of walking past it. That sofa waited 60 years to finally tell its story. I'm grateful, more than I know how to properly express, that you were the one who finally gave it the chance. That summer, Walter proposed to Grace in the same small garden where their friendship had first deepened into something more, surrounded, fittingly, by the extended family the old sofa had helped bring together. Sophia, present for the joyful occasion, despite her advancing age, watched with visible delight as Grace said yes, tears of happiness streaming down both their faces. I never expected, Grace told her gathered friends and new family later that evening, that buying a $20 sofa at a yard sale would eventually lead me here, to a genuine, unexpected family, to real closure about my own past, and now, to a new beginning I never saw coming. I think that's the real lesson in all of this. You never really know which small, ordinary moment might end up mattering more than almost anything else in your life. Lisa, standing nearby with her own young daughter on her hip, a great-great-granddaughter Sophia had lived to meet, something she described often as one of the great, unexpected gifts of her long life, smiled warmly at the sentiment. I think, Lisa said, we should probably keep that sofa in the family forever, at this point, given everything it's brought us. Agreed, Walter said, laughing warmly, pulling Grace close beside him. Some things are simply too important to ever let go of again. In the years that followed, the story of the yard sale sofa became something of a treasured family legend, told and retold at holiday gatherings, at Lisa's daughter's birthday parties, at the many quiet, ordinary family moments that followed in the wake of that single, unexpected discovery. Sophia, who lived to be 99 years old, often told the story herself, in her later years, to anyone willing to listen, nurses at the care facility, visiting friends, her great-great-granddaughter, who grew up hearing it so many times she could recite the details herself by the time she was old enough to understand their full significance. The lesson, Sophia would say, settled comfortably on the same worn, floral sofa that had traveled such an unlikely, meaningful journey across so many decades and so many lives, isn't really about the letter, or even about the truth it finally revealed. The lesson is about paying attention to the small, quiet nudges life sometimes gives you, the sign at the end of a street you almost drive past, the small lump beneath a cushion you almost ignore, the difficult conversation you almost avoid having. Sometimes those small moments of paying attention end up mattering more than anything else you'll ever do. Grace, listening to Sophia tell the story once more during a warm family gathering many years later, found herself smiling at the truth of it, remembering still vividly after all this time, the tired Saturday morning, when something quiet and insistent had made her turn her car around, setting into motion a chain of events that had, against every reasonable expectation, changed not just her own life, but the lives of an entire family she had never even known existed, all because of one old, worn, remarkably meaningful green sofa. Grace and Walter married the following spring, in a small ceremony held, fittingly, in the same garden at Sophia's care facility where Walter had proposed. Sophia, 97 that year, insisted on attending despite her family's gentle concern about the effort it might require. She sat in a place of honor near the front, wrapped in a soft shawl despite the warm weather, watching with quiet joy as Grace walked down a short aisle of folding chairs toward Walter, who stood waiting with tears already gathering in his eyes. I never thought, Sophia whispered to Lisa, who sat beside her holding her hand, that I would live to see something so wonderful grow out of something that began with so much old pain. Your great-grandfather's letter, that sofa, all of it somehow led to this. Lisa squeezed her grandmother's hand gently. I think that's the part of the story I like best, she said. Not that the pain happened, that something good grew out of it anyway, because people were brave enough to look at it honestly instead of leaving it buried. The ceremony was simple and warm, filled with the easy joy of two people who had found each other through unlikely circumstances and built something steady and real together. Grace's vows, when she spoke them, included a small nod to the sofa itself. "I never expected," she said, looking into Walter's eyes, "that a $20 piece of furniture would end up leading me to the truest, most unexpected family I've ever known, and to you. I'm grateful every single day for the small decision to turn my car around." In the months following the wedding, Sophia's health began, gradually, to decline, not dramatically, but in the slow, gentle way that sometimes comes with reaching the far edges of a very long life. She remained mentally sharp and emotionally present, delighting in visits from Lisa's young daughter Emma, and from Grace and Walter, who visited nearly every week, often bringing small treats or simply sitting with her in comfortable, easy silence on the old green sofa that had by now become something like the emotional center of the entire extended family's story. "I've made my peace with most things in my life," Sophia told Grace one quiet afternoon, the two of them sitting together while Walter ran an errand. "But I find myself thinking, more and more these days, about Joseph. About what those last years of his life might have been like, alone with that regret, never finding the courage to actually send what he wrote." "Do you wish you could have found him before he passed?" Grace asked gently. Sophia considered the question for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I think, if I had found him while there was still time, I might have been too angry to really hear him. I think, in a strange way, receiving his words now, so many years later, after so much of my own anger has softened with time, I think that might actually be the right timing, even though it feels terribly sad that it took this long." As the years passed, Lisa's daughter Emma grew up with the story of the yard sale sofa woven naturally into the fabric of her childhood, not as a dramatic family secret, but as a comfortable, familiar tale told at bedtime, at holidays, at the many quiet moments when family history gets passed down from one generation to the next. By the time Emma was 8 years old, she could recite the basic outline of the story herself, the sign Grace almost drove past, the lump in the cushion, the letter, the reunion between her great-great-grandmother Sophia and the family history she had waited so long to understand. "Great-grandma Sophia?" Emma asked one afternoon, sitting on the famous green sofa itself during a family visit. "Do you think there are other secrets hiding in old furniture, waiting for someone to find them?" Sophia laughed warmly at the question, delighted by her great-great-granddaughter's imagination. "I think," she said, "that furniture doesn't usually hide secrets on its own. Sweetheart, I think it's really about the people who once owned it, and the things they were too afraid or too heartbroken to say out loud while they had the chance. I think the real lesson isn't about old furniture at all. It's about not waiting too long to say the important things to the people you love, while you still have the chance to say them properly, out loud, instead of hoping someone finds them by accident someday." Emma considered this seriously, in the thoughtful way children sometimes surprise adults with. "I'm going to tell my mom I love her every single day, then," she said decisively, "so nobody has to find it hidden in a couch someday." Sophia laughed again, pulling her great-great-granddaughter into a warm embrace. "That," she said, "is exactly the right lesson to take from all of this." 2 years into her marriage with Walter, Grace discovered she was pregnant, news that brought a fresh wave of joy to the entire extended family, given that Grace, now 37, had quietly worried, in the years following her divorce, that she might never have the chance to become a mother at all. The pregnancy was closely followed by everyone in their unusual, unlikely family circle. Sophia, delighted by the news despite her advancing frailty, made Grace promise to bring the baby to visit as soon as possible after the birth. "I don't know how much longer I'll be here," Sophia said gently, without sadness, simply with the plain, practical honesty that comes with a very long life nearing its natural end. "But I would very much like to meet this next chapter of our unlikely family, if I'm lucky enough for the timing to allow it." Grace, moved deeply by the request, promised without hesitation. The following winter, Grace gave birth to a healthy daughter, whom she and Walter named Sophia Marianne Whitfield. honoring both the great-grandmother whose long-buried letter had begun this entire remarkable chapter, and the daughter, Marianne, who had never gotten the chance to read it herself. When baby Sophia was just 3 weeks old, Grace and Walter brought her to the care facility to meet her elderly namesake, a moment that everyone present understood, without needing to say it aloud, carried enormous emotional weight for the entire family. Sophia, now 98 and increasingly frail, held the newborn carefully in her thin, trembling arms, tears streaming freely down her weathered face as she looked down at the tiny baby who now carried her name forward into a new generation. "I never imagined," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I would live to see this. A baby, named for me, born because a young woman I'd never met decided to turn her car around one Saturday morning, all those years ago. Life has a way of surprising you, right up until the very end, if you stay open enough to let it." She looked up at Grace, her eyes bright with emotion despite her physical frailty. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving an old woman more joy in her last years than she ever expected to receive." "Thank you," Grace said, her own voice thick with emotion, "for trusting me with your family's story in the first place. None of this would have happened without your courage in reading that letter, all those years ago." Sophia passed away peacefully 3 months later, surrounded by her family, Lisa and Emma at her bedside, Walter and Grace nearby with baby Sophia sleeping quietly in her carrier, the entire unlikely, hard-won family that had formed around one old sofa and one long-hidden letter, gathered together in her final, peaceful hours. Her funeral, held the following week, was attended by a surprisingly large gathering of people whose lives she had touched across her remarkably long life, old friends from decades past, staff and fellow residents from the care facility who had grown fond of her warm, thoughtful presence, and, of course, the family whose reunion her husband's long-lost letter had ultimately made possible. Lisa gave the eulogy, speaking with quiet, steady emotion about her grandmother's remarkable capacity for forgiveness, even so late in life, even after so many decades of unanswered questions and quiet pain. "My grandmother taught me," Lisa said, looking out at the gathered mourners, "that it's never too late to receive the truth, and it's never too late to let that truth soften old anger into something more like peace." She waited nearly 40 years to understand why her husband left, and when she finally did understand, she chose grace over bitterness, even though bitterness would have been, in many ways, the easier and more understandable response. I think that's the truest lesson of her long, remarkable life. At the reception following the funeral, the family gathered once more around the old green sofa, which Walter had arranged to have moved to his and Grace's home following Sophia's passing, ensuring it would remain, permanently now, at the center of the family it had done so much to heal. The sofa, now well over 65 years old, showed clear signs of its long age and long journey. The fabric faded further, the frame slightly worn from decades of use. Walter, unwilling to let it simply deteriorate further, arranged for a careful, respectful restoration, choosing to preserve the original floral fabric pattern rather than replacing it entirely, wanting to honor its history rather than erase it. "I want Emma and baby Sophia and any other grandchildren who come along to be able to sit on this exact sofa someday," Walter told Grace, as they discussed the restoration together. "Not a replica, not something that just looks similar, the actual sofa that started all of this. I think that matters, somehow, in a way that's hard to fully explain." End quote. The restoration took several months, carefully preserving as much of the original material as possible, while reinforcing the frame and cushions, enough to ensure it would remain sturdy and comfortable for years to come. When it was finally returned to their living room, freshly restored but still unmistakably itself, Grace sat down on it with baby Sophia in her arms, feeling the same quiet, comforting rightness she had felt on that very first evening years earlier, when she had first brought it home from Walter's original yard sale, never imagining the remarkable journey it would eventually lead her on. In the years following Sophia's passing, Lisa found herself thinking often about the strange, powerful way her family's story had unfolded, how a single act of kindness from a stranger had ultimately unlocked healing that had eluded her own mother for her entire life. She began, gradually, incorporating some of what she'd learned into her own approach to parenting Emma, making a deliberate effort to have the difficult, honest conversations her mother, Marianne, had never had the chance to have with her own father. I don't ever want Emma to wonder about anything important the way my mother wondered about her father for her whole life, Lisa told Grace one afternoon, the two women having grown genuinely close over the years since their families had become intertwined. I want her to always know she can ask me anything, and that I'll answer honestly, even when it's difficult. I think that's a beautiful thing to want for her, Grace said. I think in a way, that's the real gift Sophia's story left behind, not just the reunion itself, but the lesson underneath it, about the cost of silence and the value of honest, difficult conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. I've started writing Emma letters. Actually, she admitted. Nothing dramatic. Just small notes, every so often, about things I want her to know. How proud I am of her, things I've learned, things I hope she remembers if I'm ever not around to say them myself. I keep them in a box in my closet. I suppose it's my own small way of making sure nothing important gets lost, the way it almost did with my mother and grandfather. Inspired by Lisa's example, the extended family gradually developed a new, meaningful tradition. Each year, on the anniversary of the day Grace had first found the hidden letter in the sofa cushion, the family would gather together, Grace, Walter, their growing children, Lisa, Emma, and eventually Emma's own family as the years progressed, to share stories, memories, and increasingly their own written letters to one another, read aloud or simply exchanged privately, ensuring that no important truth would ever again remain hidden or unspoken within their family for decades at a time. I think great-grandma Sophia would have loved this, Emma said, now a teenager, during one of these annual gatherings, looking around at the family that had grown, over the years, from the unlikely beginning of one stranger's kindness at a yard sale into something rich, connected, and deeply rooted in honest, open communication. I think she would have too, Lisa agreed, smiling warmly at her daughter. I think this is exactly the kind of family she always hoped we could become, even during the many years when old silence and old pain kept us more distant than we should have been. Years passed, and young Sophia Marianne Whitfield grew into a thoughtful, curious child, much like her elderly namesake had been described by everyone who remembered her. At 6 years old, sitting on the same restored green sofa that had started her family's remarkable story, young Sophia asked her mother the same question children in this family seemed destined, generation after generation, to eventually ask. "Mommy, tell me the sofa story again." Grace smiled, settling in beside her daughter, ready to tell the tale once more, exactly as she had told it many times before, and exactly as she suspected she would continue telling it for many years to come. "A long time ago," she began, "I was driving home, tired, thinking about nothing very important at all, when I saw a small sign at the end of a street that said yard sale. I almost didn't stop, but something made me turn my car around anyway." As she told the story, watching her daughter's face light up with the same wonder every child in the family seemed to feel hearing it, Grace found herself, as she often did during these tellings, reflecting on the strange, quiet power of small decisions. The choice to turn around, the choice to look closely at an old cushion, the choice to return a letter to its rightful owner, instead of simply discarding it or keeping it out of idle curiosity. "The lesson," she told her daughter, echoing the words she had heard from old Sophia so many years earlier, "is to always pay attention to the small, quiet moments life gives you. You never know which one might end up changing everything." Walter, now in his 70s himself, often thought back on the remarkable turn his life had taken since that ordinary Saturday when he'd simply been trying to downsize a few old family belongings before a difficult move. He had expected, that day, nothing more than a modest yard sale, a small amount of extra cash, and the practical relief of one less large piece of furniture to worry about moving. Instead, he had found, through the unlikely kindness of a stranger and the remarkable letter she'd uncovered, not just closure for his late wife's family, but an entirely new chapter of his own life. A second marriage, a new daughter, and a family that had grown, richly and unexpectedly, out of the very furniture he had once been ready to simply give away for $20. "I think about it often," he told Grace, One quiet evening, the two of them sitting together on the restored sofa, after young Sophia had gone to bed. How close I came to simply selling that sofa to anyone who happened to stop that day, never knowing what it carried inside it. How close you came to driving right past that sign, the way you almost did. I think about that too, Grace admitted. I don't know what made me turn around that day. Some small, quiet instinct, I suppose. I'm endlessly grateful I listened to it. Walter reached over, taking her hand gently in his. So am I, he said softly. More grateful than I know how to properly express, even after all these years. Many years later, when young Sophia Marianne Whitfield had grown into an adult herself, with children and grandchildren of her own, the story of the yard sale sofa remained a treasured, living piece of family history, retold at every family gathering, written down eventually in a small family history book that Lisa had compiled and printed for future generations, and passed on, generation after generation, alongside the enduring lesson at its heart. The sofa itself, restored once more over the decades as needed, remained a physical centerpiece of the family's story, no longer simply an old piece of furniture, but a symbol, carried carefully forward through each new generation, of the quiet, powerful truth that had shaped their family's entire modern history. That healing, however delayed, however unlikely, remains possible when people choose courage over silence, and that the smallest, most ordinary decisions, turning a car around, checking beneath a cushion, returning something that isn't yours to keep, can sometimes change the entire course of more lives than anyone could have possibly imagined at the time. Every family has its story, old Sophia had once said. In the final years of her long, remarkable life, ours just happens to be hiding in the cushions.